My name is Claire, and I've always been fascinated by abandoned places. So when I heard about Harrowsbrook Mental Asylum, a place that had been closed down after a series of tragic events, I couldn't resist. The stories surrounding the asylum were strange patients who went missing, eerie lights seen at night, and the disappearance of the warden himself. But what intrigued me the most was the locked basement, a place that no one had ever been able to access. I visited the asylum with a group of friends, ready to uncover the truth. The building was towering, a grim structure that seemed to stretch forever, surrounded by thick, twisted trees. We snuck through the broken gate and into the building. The halls were filled with the smell of rot, and the walls were stained with years of neglect. It felt like the air itself was trapped inside, carrying the weight of a long-forgotten past. We made our way through the asylum, exploring old rooms that once held the patients. Some rooms still had their beds and personal items left behind. There was a sense of sadness in the air, like the place had been frozen in time. But then we found the basement door, the one that was always kept locked. It was old and rusted, but, to my surprise, it was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to descend into the darkness below. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air became thicker with each step. As we reached the bottom, I could feel a chill in my bones, a sense of foreboding that made it difficult to breathe. The basement was like something out of a nightmare. The walls were covered in old, tattered patient records, some of them written in smeared ink. There were strange symbols drawn on the walls, symbols I couldn't recognize, but that seemed to have an ominous significance. In the center of the room stood an old iron chair, shackles attached to its arms and legs. As we moved closer, I felt the temperature drop, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was then that I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner. We all froze. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when I turned my flashlight toward the noise, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, crouched in the corner, was scratching the walls with its nails. Its face was hidden, but it turned toward us with a slow, jerky motion. It was human, but barely. Its eyes were hollow, and its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. I couldn't move. The figure stood up, its long arms reaching out toward us. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My friends were frozen too, staring at the figure with wide, horrified eyes. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, disappearing into the shadows of the basement. We ran. We ran as fast as we could, desperate to escape the basement. But when we reached the stairs, the door slammed shut behind us. We were trapped. For what felt like hours, we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The scratching sound began again, louder this time, as if it was coming from inside the walls. Suddenly, we heard laughter, soft at first, then louder, a deep, eerie laugh that seemed to come from the very walls of the basement. It was the warden's laugh. We finally managed to break the door open and fled into the night. As we ran away from the asylum, I looked back one last time. The lights inside flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the warden's face in the window, a face twisted in a grin, his hollow eyes staring back at me. Even now, I hear his laughter. The warden never left the asylum. He's still down there, waiting, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can hear the scratching again, coming from the depths of the basement. My name is Mark, and I've never been one to believe in ghosts or curses. But that all changed when I visited the Ashford Psychiatric Hospital. The hospital had been abandoned for nearly 20 years after a series of unexplained deaths among both patients and staff. People said the place was haunted, but I thought it was all just legend. I had to see it for myself. I ventured there alone, sneaking in after dark. The building was massive, a sprawling structure with long, winding corridors that seemed to go on forever. The doors creaked open as I stepped inside, the sound echoing in the dead silence. My flashlight flickered as I made my way through the dusty halls, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. I explored room after room, each one more unsettling than the last. Some were filled with old hospital beds, their sheets still intact, others with piles of medical records left scattered across the floor. But it wasn't just the physical decay that bothered me, was the feeling of being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. As I walked down one of the long corridors, I heard footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was just my imagination. But then the footsteps grew louder, closer, almost like someone was following me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out in front of me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the building settling. But as I continued, the footsteps didn't stop. They kept following me, echoing in the darkness. Then, I heard a voice, a soft whisper. It came from a room ahead of me. I cautiously approached the door and slowly pushed it open. Inside was a room completely untouched by time. Furniture still stood neatly in place, as though the occupants had left just moments before. On the walls were scribbles, crude drawings that looked like they had been made in a panic. One of the drawings stood out, a figure, dark and tall, with no face, its arms stretching out toward the door. Suddenly, I heard the door slam shut behind me, and the whispering started again, this time much louder. "Leave now," it said, and I could feel my heart race in my chest. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. The whispering grew frantic, the words now jumbled together in an incomprehensible chant. I banged on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps came again, only now they were not behind me, but all around me, moving in unison. I turned, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, looming in the doorway. It stepped forward, its presence suffocating the room with an unnatural cold. The thing had no face, just an endless black void where its features should have been. I screamed and finally forced the door open. I ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get out. The hospital seemed to stretch endlessly, and every turn I made brought me back to the same hallway. I was trapped in an endless loop, the footsteps and whispering closing in on me. It was like the building itself was alive, playing with me. Finally, I stumbled upon a stairwell and bolted down to the exit. When I burst through the door into the night air, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But even now, I can still hear the footsteps behind me. The whispers have never stopped. The hospital is still there, waiting for me to return. My name is David, and I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, especially hospitals. So, when I learned about the infamous Greystone Asylum, I knew I had to explore it. The asylum had been shut down after a series of mysterious deaths and rumors of paranormal activity. It had been years since anyone had stepped foot inside, but the stories of its haunted halls were still fresh in my mind. I arrived at the asylum at dusk, the building casting long, eerie shadows across the field that surrounded it. The windows were boarded up, but the door was cracked open, inviting me in. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. The floors creaked under my weight, and the silence was almost suffocating. As I walked deeper into the building, I began to notice the strange marks on the wall, scratches, scrawled words, and handprints as though the patients had been desperately trying to escape. The atmosphere felt heavy, like something was watching me from the dark corners of each room. I stumbled upon an old nurse's station, the desks still covered in yellowed papers. In the far corner, there was a small black and white photo, a portrait of the asylum's staff. The faces were faded, but one thing stood out, a nurse with a blank expression, staring directly into the camera. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at her face, her eyes seeming to follow me. I moved on, my nerves beginning to fray, but then I heard a faint, eerie moan. I froze. It came from the far end of the hall. Cautiously, I approached the source, the noise growing louder. When I reached the door, I found it ajar. I pushed it open. Inside, there was no one, just an empty room, but the air was thick with coldness, and the moans continued, coming from the walls themselves. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, but that's when I saw them shadowy figures, standing motionless in the hallway. Their faces were obscured, but their bodies were twisted and unnatural. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my mouth. The figures began to move toward me, their limbs jerking unnaturally, their faces now clear, but distorted in a permanent scream. I turned to run, but the hall seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, the exit nowhere in sight. The moans grew louder until they were deafening. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the cold fingers of the patients still trapped in the asylum, reaching out to grab me. They wanted me to join them, to never leave. Finally, I found the exit and stumbled outside, gasping for breath. But even now, I can still hear the moans echoing in my ears. The patients never left, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can hear their whispers calling me back to the Greystone Asylum. My name is Lisa, and I never considered myself a superstitious person. I believed the rational explanations for everything until the night I visited Briarwood Asylum. The asylum had been abandoned after reports of inhumane treatments and strange occurrences within its walls. It was said that the patients who had died there never truly left. I went there with a small group of friends, all eager to see if the rumors were true. We entered the asylum late at night, flashlights in hand, ready to explore. The place was silent, its once grand structure now deteriorating, a shadow of its former self. The walls were lined with cracked mirrors, broken windows, and old medical equipment strewn across the floors. The air was heavy, as if it had been soaked in fear for years. We laughed nervously, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. But the deeper we went into the asylum, the more I began to sense something wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing footsteps echoing down the empty halls, but whenever I turned to look, no one was there. It wasn't until we reached the old patient wing that things took a turn. The temperature dropped suddenly, and our breaths became visible in the air. In the hallway ahead of us, I saw a figure, standing motionless. It was tall, dark, and blurry, like a shadow that didn't belong. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I whispered to my friends, but they didn't see it. They continued walking ahead, not noticing the figure at the end of the hallway. I stepped closer, unable to look away from it, and that's when it moved slowly, unnaturally, gliding toward me. My pulse quickened, and I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, but the figure was gone. My friends turned to me, laughing at the frightened look on my face, but I knew I had seen something. The air had changed. The darkness around us seemed to have come alive, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut, and we were plunged into darkness. We screamed, desperate to escape, but every exit we tried led us in a circle. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the shadow appeared again, flickering in and out of sight. As I ran, I could feel it following me, moving faster than I could, whispering something I couldn't understand. Finally, I reached the front door, and it opened with a creak. We ran outside, gasping for air, the night strangely still around us. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see the figure, its dark, shadowy form, always waiting in the corners of my mind. My name is Jacob, and I've always been curious about abandoned places, especially hospitals. So when I heard about St. Vincent's Asylum, I had to go. It had been closed for decades, but stories of unnatural occurrences still lingered. People spoke of strange lights, whispers in the dark, and a room that no one dared enter. Ward 13. I arrived alone, determined to uncover the truth. The building stood in the middle of a forest, hidden from the public eye. When I first entered, the smell of old antiseptic and dampness overwhelmed me. The halls were decayed, lined with empty rooms that seemed to echo with lost voices. I made my way through the building, exploring the remnants of the past. Old medical equipment, tattered patient records, and forgotten belongings scattered throughout the rooms. It was disturbing but fascinating at the same time. But then, I found Ward 13. The door was locked, but the glass in the window had been shattered. I pushed through the broken frame and stepped inside. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and the walls were covered in faint handprints, as if someone or something had touched them in desperation. The room was bare, save for an old gurney in the corner, stained with something dark and dried. As I stepped closer to inspect it, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My heart started to race, and I turned around. The door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then, the whispers started low at first, like a distant murmur. I couldn't make out the words, but they were clear, persistent. I backed away from the door, but that's when I saw them shadowy figures, standing at the far end of the room, watching me. They didn't move at first, just stood there, staring. But then, one of them started to advance, slow and deliberate, its form shifting with every step. It was as though the figure wasn't entirely human, its body a mash of faces, each one twisted in pain and anguish. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers grew louder, becoming maddening, filling my ears with broken phrases. Get out. Never leave. I stumbled backward, feeling the weight of the room press down on me. The figures were getting closer, their faces becoming clearer with every step. I had to get out, but the door wouldn't open. The room seemed to shrink, its walls closing in. With one final push, I slammed against the door, and it broke open. I ran without looking back, hearing the whispers fade as I escaped into the night. But even now, I hear them. The voices, the faces, and sometimes, I wonder if I ever really left Ward 13. My name is Sarah, and I never believed in the supernatural. That was, until I found myself standing in the crumbling halls of Westgate Asylum. The place had been abandoned for years, yet rumors of strange lights flickering in the windows and unsettling sounds echoing at night still persisted. They said that the asylum never truly closed, and the spirits of the patients remained, trapped within its walls. I had gone there with a group of urban explorers, hoping to uncover the truth behind the rumors. The outside of the asylum was decrepit, its walls covered in graffiti, and windows shattered by time. The building loomed in front of us like a forgotten monument, its very presence unsettling. As we entered the asylum, the silence was deafening. The hallways stretched on endlessly, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of rot and decay. The further we ventured, the more I began to feel uneasy, as though something was watching us. But I dismissed it as nerves until we reached Room 11. Room 11 had been the heart of the asylum, where the most violent and disturbed patients were held. As we walked inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a faint murmur filled the air. I thought it was one of my friends, but when I turned to speak, I saw that everyone else was staring at the far corner of the room. There, in the darkness, was a figure, a shadow, hunched and still, standing perfectly still. We called out, but the figure didn't respond. In a rush of adrenaline, we moved toward it, but just as we reached the spot, the figure vanished. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. It was impossible. We were alone in the building. The footsteps grew louder, getting closer, as though someone or something was following us. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us. We were trapped. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, becoming indistinguishable from one another. A chorus of voices from the walls. One voice, in particular, stood out. It was soft, like a plea, but chilling in its desperation. "Help me, please. They won't let me out." As we searched for another way out, the walls began to pulse, as if something was alive inside them. The footsteps were now accompanied by the sound of chains rattling, dragging along the floor. We could hear them getting closer, the noise filling the air, suffocating us in the chaos. One of my friends, Ryan, disappeared. We called out to him, but there was no answer. His name echoed down the hallway, lost in the endless corridors. Frantic, we ran through the asylum, but no matter how far we went, we couldn't escape. Finally, we stumbled upon the exit, only to find it locked from the outside. We were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by the voices of the lost, forever bound to a place that never truly closed. My name is Mark, and I never believed in ghosts. At least, that's what I told myself before I spent the night in Ward B of the Holloway Asylum, a place once notorious for housing the most dangerous individuals with severe mental illnesses. The hospital had been abandoned for years, but there were still whispers of the patients that never left, and the sinister events that led to its closure. I visited with a group of friends, eager for the thrill of exploring one of the most haunted places in the country. We joked, laughing at the thought of being scared by an old building, but the moment we entered, everything changed. The building was a time capsule frozen in decay. The walls were stained with what I could only assume were years of blood, and the air was so heavy with mold, it was hard to breathe. We made our way to room 214, a room notorious for its violent past. As soon as we stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. The walls were cracked, and the floor was covered in debris. But what caught my attention were the old chains bolted to the walls, remnants of the restraints once used to hold patients. We dared each other to explore further. Despite the discomfort creeping up my spine, I entered the room alone, feeling an odd pull toward the back of the room, where an old rocking chair sat near the window. The chair creaked as if someone had been sitting in it moments ago. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard a faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was one of my friends messing with me, but the whisper came again, this time clearer. "Help me." I turned quickly, but no one was there. I scanned the room, the feeling of eyes watching me growing stronger. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of scratching against the walls. The air became thick with an oppressive presence. The room felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. I ran to the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. I banged against it, yelling for help, but the others were outside, unable to hear me. The whispers turned to voices, all speaking at once, begging for freedom. Suddenly, I felt something cold grip my ankle, pulling me toward the center of the room. I screamed, kicking at whatever was holding me, but it wouldn't let go. "Let me out," I cried, desperate. The chains on the walls rattled violently, and the voices became frantic. Finally, the door flung open, and my friends pulled me out of the room. I was shaken, panting for breath, but the moment I stepped outside, I felt the pressure lift. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voices never stopped whispering, and to this day, I still hear them calling to me from room 214. My name is Emily, and I had always heard about Elmwood Psychiatric Hospital, how it had been shut down after the scandalous disappearance of Dr. Victor Caldwell, the head psychiatrist. The rumors were dark. Patients had vanished, and some believed Dr. Caldwell had been conducting twisted experiments trying to find a cure for the mind by using cruel methods. When I arrived, the air was dense with the weight of history, and the hospital's old, deteriorating structure seemed to have absorbed the pain of all those who had suffered there. I couldn't resist. I had to explore. Inside, everything was eerily still. The floors were slick with dampness, and the walls echoed with my every step. The smell of antiseptic lingered faintly in the air, though it was long past its prime. I wandered deeper into the hospital, making my way through the halls, all while trying to decipher what had gone wrong here. Then, I came across room 107. It was locked, but as I peered through the narrow window in the door, I saw figures sitting on the bed, perfectly still. My curiosity got the best of me. I managed to pry the door open with a crowbar. As soon as I stepped inside, I froze. The room had been left as if the patient had just walked out. Fresh bandages, scattered papers, and in the corner, an old wheelchair. But what made my blood run cold was the figure on the bed. It was a man, sitting upright, with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide open, and his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. I stepped closer, and then I saw it, a note pinned to his chest, reading, "I am still waiting." My heart raced as I looked back at the door. I felt the temperature in the room drop. I suddenly realized I wasn't alone. The air was thick, and it was as if I could feel something watching me. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. I spun around, but the figure was gone. The bed was empty, but the smile remained, etched into my mind, as if I could still see it lingering in the shadows. I ran for the exit, but as I passed the nurse's station, I saw a photograph on the wall. Dr. Caldwell, standing next to a patient. The patient in the photo had the same twisted smile, the same empty eyes. I never found the exit. I kept running through the endless halls, but every time I turned a corner, I ended up back in that same room. Eventually, I stopped running, and that's when I heard his voice, cold and clear. "You're my last patient, Emily." My name is Jack, and I've always been fascinated by abandoned hospitals and asylums. They've always been the perfect blend of history and terror. So, when I heard about Greystone Asylum, I knew I had to visit. It was a sprawling complex, on the edge of town, abandoned for decades, but still holding on to its dark past. The locals spoke of the place in hushed tones, of patients who had never left, of experiments gone wrong. Most of them avoided the area, saying the air was thick with unfinished business. But I was determined to see it for myself. I arrived late in the afternoon. The building loomed over me like a giant, skeletal figure, its windows shattered, and its doors rusted shut. I found an entrance on the side, a cracked door that opened with a painful screech. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The floors were covered in debris, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper. But as I ventured deeper into the asylum, I noticed something. Eyes. They were everywhere at first. I thought it was my imagination, the shadows playing tricks on me. But no, the eyes, dozens of them, were watching me from the cracks in the walls, from the broken windows, from the darkness. I could hear faint whispers, low and guttural. The eyes seemed to follow me, no matter where I went. I tried to ignore it, but the pressure of their gaze was unbearable. I stumbled into a room, and that's when I saw it. The mirror on the wall. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a window into something else. I could see people inside, staring back at me. Their faces were twisted, contorted in pain and madness. They didn't move, just stared, their eyes wide and pleading. I reached out to touch the glass, but before I could, a loud bang echoed through the room. I spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, hunched over, with hollow eyes. It didn't speak, it just pointed to the mirror. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around me. The walls started to move, the eyes grew bigger, and the whispers became screams. I bolted for the exit, but as I turned the corner, I saw something that made my heart stop. All around me, in the shadows, were hundreds of eyes, staring at me, watching me, as if they had always been there, waiting. I ran, and I never looked back. My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to abandoned places. The thrill of exploring decaying buildings, uncovering forgotten history, it's what I live for. That's why, when I found out about St. Martin's Asylum, I couldn't resist. The asylum had been shut down in the early 70s, after a series of mysterious deaths among the patients, and ever since, the place had been sealed off by the authorities. But I had my ways. I managed to get in. The air inside was thick with the smell of mold, and the floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the corridors. I pulled out my flashlight and began to explore, taking photos of the rusted doors, cracked windows, and peeling paint. As I made my way deeper into the building, I could hear something faint like whispers coming from the walls. I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder. I walked faster, my heart racing as I entered the main hallway. The whispers were now accompanied by low, guttural sounds, almost like voices trying to speak but distorted. I turned the corner and froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure, a shadowy silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it didn't move. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the thick silence. The figure didn't respond. I took a step forward. That's when I heard the laughter. It came from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floors. It was all around me. I turned and ran, but the sound of footsteps echoed behind me, fast and frantic, like someone or something was chasing me. I reached the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, then I saw it. A single, bloody handprint appeared on the door. I pushed with all my strength, and finally, the door opened. I stumbled outside and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The whispers faded, but I could still hear the laughter in my head.